So the reading is Jesus stilling the storm. So as always, I like to think of the context in which this event occurs. Jesus has been, it's early in the ministry, it's just the 4th chapter of Mark. He's been calling his disciples, he has been healing people, he has been teaching people, and that's been happening all day, and it's hot. I know that my friends who went to seminary together early on in our ministry, we would call each other, even when we were young, we'd go, I get home from church and I'm exhausted. Just exhausted. And they go, yeah, clergy coma. That's what we call it. So on Sunday afternoons, we're pretty much done. But Jesus had done this all day. All day. He had been out in the hot sun all day. And because the crowds were gathering, he always wanted to go to a new place to continue to teach and to preach and to let people know about God. And so he was going to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is actually just a large lake. But they had gotten the boats ready. There was a group of boats going over, and so they had made a place that he could rest in the stern of the boat. And so here's what happens. So on that day, again, teaching, working, when evening had come, he said, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with him in the boat, just as he was. The other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushions. And they woke him up, and they said to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." The wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" There ends the reading. May God add a blessing. I think if I was one of those fishermen, I would have very much been afraid. They were making their living in the sea. They had gone out in boats since they could go out in a boat, probably since they were as old as Hope was, because they learned how to help and they learned their craft by growing into it with their parents. And so they had known men who had died at sea. This was not a place where you were ever to turn your back on the sea and the waves and the wind. And so, of course, they were frightened. Jesus is like, "What's up? Why did you wake me? Are you still afraid?" And again, what do you know? You're a carpenter. We're a fisherman. We know what to be afraid of. And of course, what he does again and again and again is bring God's presence and strength into that moment. Calms the wind, calms the sea, says, "Peace, be still, have faith." And it grows the disciples' faith because now they've experienced even more deeply who it is that Jesus is in their lives and in the world. But I think more than telling this story so that we know that that event occurred, and we know that Jesus was able to calm the wind and the sea somehow because of his words, because of what he was, because of who he was. I think it's also written for the early church, because it had to be frightening in that first generation to believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. People were literally arrested and killed for professing themselves as Christian. They, if they were lucky, lost their job, lost their livelihood, sometimes would lose all of their possessions. Again, I was just reading from Acts, I'm doing that on Wednesdays, and these men who are openly saying that Jesus is the Christ, the one, the Son of God, which is in Jewish realm blasphemy, are being arrested and threatened with death. So there was a long history of being a Christian, but also knowing that you could be arrested, killed, thrown out of town, lose your livelihood, lose everything you had. And so I think that this passage is also written for those first Christians who became worried and frightened about what would happen to them if they continued to believe. And so Mark wants to make sure this story is included, that in the midst of all of the storms that are around you, threats and hard life and things happening that are tough to happen, that God in Jesus Christ is able to still the storm. For me, that's one of the best gifts about being a Christian, is the fact that I have a God who knows me, sees into my heart, can calm all of the hardness and just difficulties of life. For whatever reason, and I always wonder why I think about what I think about as I start these sermons, I was thinking not only about the song that is so helpful to me, and I think about that soul anchor in my life, the anchor that holds on to me, the anchor that I can hold on to, but also about videotaping and all of the videotapes that I have made since the pandemic started and how uncomfortable I am in general with that. But lately it gets about 6 views, so I'm like, yeah, I'm good. Not a whole lot. And I thought about that witness of faith that God has enabled me to do. And it's interesting, if I look back, it used to be more when we were in pandemic days. But there was a videotape that I made, a live feed that I made after Brian's death. And I just kind of said what had happened. That video has had over 500 views. And that amazes me, because I watched it once again and it's painful to me to watch. But I think what God enabled in that moment, because I know it wasn't me, was to say that in the midst of this storm in my life, in the midst of the pain that is throughout my body and my day, God is walking me through. Because I believed it, I lived it, I knew it. And it is that assurance of faith that the disciples learn as they see Jesus saying, I got this. We don't have to worry. We don't have to be afraid. And I've thought that for a long time in my spiritual life, in my Christian life. Because if the worst that you can throw at me is death, then God's got me on the other side. If the worst you can throw at me is pain and loss, then I can always go to God and find strength there. But on this Father's Day, I also want to say that that didn't come out of a void. That came out of a very particular place of living, and that was my dad, who was always there. My dad who was always caring for us. My dad used to leave early in the morning and he didn't come home until about 6 at night. But you knew that he was working hard so he could get us whatever we needed. And I thought about him during this past week, when, again, you're getting ready for Father's Day and thinking about him. And I had never thought about the fact that he was about 45, I think. Well, I don't know if I figured it right, but he was somewhere in there. It was 1973. And he had lost his job because of someone else's unfaithfulness to the work. And he's the one who took the fall. Not the guy who did it, who actually owned the company. But my dad, who was vice president, became the guy who took the fall and lost his job. And as he lost his job, it meant that we lost the livelihood in Fairfax, Virginia. And a man in Hagerstown wanted to hire him because he had known Dad and knew how hard he worked. And so Dad took the job on the provision that they could work together. And so it was a 6-month kind of getting to know each other period. As I reflected on that this week and thought about what he had been through, I thought, as the youngest kid, I never really knew anything was wrong except for Dad was looking for a new job. I never really knew anything had been disrupted because my wants as a teenage girl were all the same, and it didn't seem as though anybody ever said no. Of course, we were raised by Depression era people, and so your wants were never a lot, and you were told that. But it was like nothing changed. And yet he left this job under difficult circumstances. He came up here to start another job, to get land, to build a house that he'd always wanted to build. And I think saw the opportunity more than the pain of being dumped on. It was years later at his retirement party that a man came up to me, and I started to unravel this I was probably 30 something at the time. And a man came up to me and he goes, "Your dad's a great man." And I said, "I know he is." "It wasn't his fault." And I went, "What happened in Fairfax? That wasn't his fault. He shouldn't have had to take the fall." And I was like, "Okay." And then as I was looking through documents and packing up the house, I found letter after letter after letter that said that Dad had not been the one who was responsible, that he should not have to bear that load. And again, I go back, and as I reflect now today, I think my dad always made sure that I was sheltered from the worst that life had to throw at him, sheltered and cared for. And even if you go back to his World War II service, sheltered so that our country could continue. I say all of this not because my dad is special, although he is. But it seems to me that most dads that I know are simply like that, are simply caring, trying to make sure their family is protected and everything they need is given to the best of their ability. The other thing was, my dad was not a church guy. He was not a man that you would have found in church on Sunday morning when I was growing up. His father had abandoned his family. He had had a tough time growing up, and I think there wasn't a whole lot of belief in a loving God there. But when I made the move to ministry, he showed up, and he always encouraged me. Never said anything negative. I think about Paul writing in 2 Corinthians. Even through hardship, even through pain, even when people don't understand, all of that doesn't matter so long as we understand our relationship with God, and that is what is grounding us, that soul anchor. I think that that's what my dad lived throughout his life. So it was easy as I became a person of faith. It was easy as I believed in God as Father because I had had one here showing me that. He had not had the gift of having a dad showing him that, but he lived it for me. And so all that we believe in faith, all that we grab hold to God's grace in our life, I pray that we have human beings around us, people around us. I pray that we become those people also, who are showing a world that God is real, that God can calm the storms in our life and carry us through, that this recent storm of the pandemic has gone mostly from around us. Downtown Frederick was hopping this morning, and it has been all week. For me, everybody gets their choice of how to see it. But for me, it is that faith and belief in Jesus who stills the storm, calms the sea, says, have faith. I got this. And I believe what it doesn't mean, it does not mean that everything will always be great every day. What it does mean for me is that when life happens, because life will happen, death is too close, it seems. Hard times are tough. Prices are going up. Jobs are not great. All of that happens. God is right there beside us, ready when we call, to hold us up, to help us believe that the stillness is in God's hand. Our faith is in God's care. And God will always see us through, even to the other side, fully with God. Those are our promises of faith. Because we travel with a man who stills the storm, calms the seas, and gives us faith to live another day. Amen.